Hi class! At this point you have either begun or completed the readings from week 2. As you know, I'll not be in class this week, and so I wanted to just spend some time with you on this video, highlighting some of the key points and takeaways as you move into the case analysis for week 2. As you know, the case will focus on Tesla, and I'm sure you're very familiar with Tesla given the huge amount of publicity today. I want to make sure that you understand some of the interpretations and just some of the key points that I think are important to get across. I'm going to drill down to some of the analysis, but let me give you an overview of our second topic, which in this case is the external environment. And as a background for framing our strategic decisions and therefore the strategic analysis, many of the frameworks that we're learning in this course have two orientations. One is looking externally, the other is internally. So when I say externally, I mean things like looking at the industry and the industry structure and getting a view of the economics. Then we try to think about how a firm can compete within that external environment, that industry structure, and also tells us a little bit or gives us some guidance about where a company can compete. This may come to mind for some of you that think about things that are happening in the external marketplace. And we talked a little bit about businesses that are new and startups and that are disrupting. A lot of times they're going into places where the incumbent firms, for example, aren't succeeding, or there are gaps, and they're trying to figure out where they can compete. How? And so that's what we mean by the external environment. Now, when you look at the internal environment, we look at things like the core competency of the company and the things that they've been able to do or the capabilities that they have. It focuses on the specific operations, initiatives, human capital decisions, and so forth that a company typically decides to invest in. Time and money is an investment, and it really helps shape how the company is going to compete. So as we look at these couple of topics, and weeks 2 and 3 particularly, thinking about what is external, what it versus is internally, it is very important that we'll try to emphasize throughout. What we're ultimately trying to do here is integrate the company's strategy and the business model. And this is a graphic that will be seen throughout some of the discussions. So by looking at the external in the internal environment and the internal environment, we're able to create our strategic vision, which is what we talked about with our first week of discussions and readings. And then we're going to try and consider the strategic options. I think that's something to take note of because strategy is a lot of times about gathering sets of options and picking the one or two which we feel are in the best interest. And then what we do is we figure out the best strategy of those options and then the business model of the firm. And if you remember last topic, we talked about the business model, which is really how a company makes money. When we begin to drill into what we do to evaluate the external environment, I'm going to talk about a couple of the specific analysis, and some of this was attached to your readings in the chapters, the discussion articles for week 2. The first is the macro environment. Now, what do we mean by the macro environment? Well, it's a broad environmental context in which an industry sits in. So every industry is a little bit different. Every environment is a little bit different. And the environments, by the way, they change, and we think about some of those relevant components. And what's important here is that a firm has no control over this. There are things like the general economic condition, the industry, the competitive environment, and some of these things that are happening and occurring, and it's not as if the firm necessarily can influence it, unless of course the firm is large enough. The structure that we use to help us evaluate the microenvironment is called the PESTLE. Sometimes you'll see it called the PES, but I like the PESTLE because I feel like it's most comprehensive. It's often also talked about in marketing, so some of you that may have taken your marketing courses may recall this. But this is a really great way to inventory and evaluate what is going on around the firm, those external considerations that the firm cannot control or necessarily influence, And that's a little bit debatable about whether or not they can influence it or not. But the pestle means political, economic conditions, social trends, technology trends, legal factors, and environmental trends. Now, what we do with each of these things means well. So let's look at these in turn. So let's look at the first component. The political trends are things like policies and processes. There are certain political events, they relate towards things like international trade, socio-cultural practices, and the institutional environment, which means regulations. And these are not just global or national. They can also be local. So for those of you who sit in Chicago, in and around Chicago, you may know that there has been quite a scuffle recently about a beverage tax. And that beverage tax is very influential to both the retail industry, specifically retailers like Target, Walmart, and then also the grocery stores like Jewel and others. Also, it's very influential to the operations of some of these beverage companies like PepsiCo and Coca-Cola. So if I had been sitting in the strategy group of Target and PepsiCo, for example, some two years ago, I might have been watching what was happening in the political discussions related to this beverage tax. And I also might be trying to put strategies in place to influence the outcome. But that's just one example. Another area the pestle focuses on in terms of a framework is the economic conditions. And these are things like GDP growth, unemployment, inflation, interest rates, trade deficits or surpluses, saving rates, per capita GDP, and then just overall conditions in the financial markets. It's also related to consumer confidence and spending, and then things like demographics. So if you're taking macroeconomics, the economic factors are those that we would consider most typical as the metrics in the subject of macroeconomics. Now, why is this something that we worry about as part of strategy? Well, there are certain economic conditions that are influential to businesses and business strategy in particular. So, for example, it is widely known that the United States population is aging, is getting older. So if you are in a business that does not service the later years of the population, then your market might be shrinking. If, however, you do service that part of the population, there could be opportunities for you to take advantage of. The next area is social trends. And these are things like our values, attitudes, cultural factors, lifestyles. Now, they can be local, they can be regional. They can be national again, global, and they can change widely. So I think a very interesting social trend that might be an example of this is food, especially here in the United States. Well, it's also global. But there's a lot of attention to food, people wanting to eat more healthy things like organic foods, fair traded foods, and sourcing directly from farms using non-GMO products. All of these things that we see both in the news and the grocery stores. And families perhaps in certain segments are much more attuned to those sorts of things. So if you're running a food company, those would be things that you'd pay attention to. If you run a restaurant chain such as McDonald's or Chipotle or Panera, you take advantage of these things or try to build them into your strategy and planning. Another trend is technology. I probably don't need to explain that very much, but there are lots of things that are going on both at the corporate level as well as the consumer level. The way that we communicate, how we use technology. You know, probably social media and things like Facebook and Instagram are some of the most dominant examples of technology. But even in the educational environment, we take online courses, and it means that the trend of online learning has become substantial enough that many universities, including North Park, are offering online education. There are legal elements that we have to take into consideration. Things like labor laws and antitrust tax policy, regulations, those sort of things. And then they may change based on the political climate. As you know, many with the current administration and our presidents, there are lots of things that are changing. One of the factors that I take particular attention to relates to immigration and some of the visa status issues that we are talking about in the news. There are many students, including some of you, that are not authorized to work in the United States. And with changes in administrations, presidentials, administrations, those rules and laws can change. And so if you're a business that has to deal with that, either with your employees or your customers or potentially your suppliers, you'd want to know that. And then finally, there are the environmental trends. There's a great deal of discussion these days about whether climate change, those sorts of things. For example, you may have heard of very recently about very devastating hurricanes in Texas, in Florida, in Puerto Rico, and that has a significant influence on businesses as well. It may influence how they do their contingency planning if they have operations in those areas. It also may affect where they source their supplies and materials. And so hopefully this gives you a little bit of flavor of the types of things that we're thinking of. So when you look at the pestle, it's important to look at both of the positive and potentially negative aspects of each of these components, because these are definitely things that companies can take advantage of. And then there are other things that you have to also be concerned about potentially when you're looking at a case analysis. So if you think of pestle, it's important to really dive in and to look at the data, to look at the evidence that these not things that are driven by opinion per se, but it's also a very fine line because some of the future trends are based on the opinions of experts. And it's important to know that this is very challenging because companies have to listen to both the facts which are built upon the data that's collected, but they also have to get some of these futurists or some experts that they're talking about to really understand what is happening. So when you approach your work to analyze the case, probably 80% of it ought to be based on the facts. None of us are really experts at the cases that we're working on, and for our purposes and for your assignments, it's far better to first discuss the facts. Then maybe if you have an opinion to bring that in and say it as so. Now when we apply the pestle, and that's a little bit about what we're trying to do is scan the environment. We're trying to gather information that's going to help us with our current state assessment, as well as evaluating the operations of the future and the options that we're going to pursue and the initiatives and the investments. So we do the scan, and then what we do is we take that data that we're collecting and then we translate that into strategic implications. What are some of the things that are opportunities and challenges to the business that come from the external environment? And in doing so, as part of our strategic analysis, we'll ask some questions within each of those areas that we identify within the pestle. What is possible? And what enables or limits what we're hoping to do? What are changes that are occurring within each of those areas? How can those changes enhance or detract from our firm and our competitive advantage relative to the market? And then, how do any changes affect the consumers that we serve, their needs, and then our ability as a firm to satisfy those needs? So we're collecting information, and then we're asking a number of questions based on that, and that helps us to begin to narrow the processes of our strategic choices. Now the next analysis I want to talk about is the 5 forces. Now I know that we've read an article about that, and what I'm going to tell you in advance, and I hope that this is something that everyone will pay attention to, is that a lot of students struggle to apply the 5 force analysis and to apply it in particularly the right way. I think everyone gets that there's 5 forces and they get the title of each force, but it's really the orientation of this analysis that's really the key here. So I'm going to do my best to explain it, and then you're going to be able to get a chance to, you will practice this analysis in your case study, and then you'll get a chance to come back to it with your final project. So the 5 forces is an analysis that was originated by Michael Porter, who was a professor at the Harvard Business School, and is prepared as a way to help companies assess if within the industry that they operate, if there are attractive opportunities for growth, and by growth we mean could there be increases in market size, which is a company, for example, selling more units, or increasing their sales values in dollars, and then helps us understand the experiences that the company might have related to the growth rate, past, current, future, and looking at the market in the industry. Growth is a very important consideration from your finance course, and ideally everyone has taken the finance course at this point, and we've learned about growth and how growth is driven by increasing profits. And by having increasing profits, company stock prices increase, And when your stock prices increases, your shareholders are rewarded, and in theory, everyone is happy. So we have some considerations when we think about growth. Different sectors and regions grow at different rates. So if you live in the upper Midwest in places like Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, the economies of those states within the United States might be growing at a different rate than, for example, the West Coast, California, Oregon, Washington. It's because they have different industry concentrations. They have different business climates, they have different business policies, and so this is a very important consideration that we have to think about. Also, industries operate at different life cycles. So they emerge, they grow quickly, they mature, and they decline. An example of this is the retail industries. So over the years, retail was very dominant. Places like Marshall Field's, Montgomery Ward's, Sears, and Wanamaker's. Well, now some of these companies actually barely exist. You may not even recognize the names like Marshall Field's or Montgomery Ward's or Wanamaker's. And Sears, for example, may be really struggling if they who knows where they're going to end up in the future. But what we've had is an emergence of these new retail companies like Amazon and other online e-commerce based businesses. So different industries are different life stages. And by the way, growth does not guarantee profitability. So just because we're growing and increasing revenue, you could be investing and spending at such a level that you don't have profit. And this just offers some of the context about why we do the 5 forces. Because we're trying to do it from the perspective of our company, looking at the industry that we sit in. Because if our industry is in decline, and we as a company want to continue to grow, there may have to be some shift that we make. I think a very clear example of this, I hope you think about Apple. Many of you are probably sitting with an iPhone next to you. You may have a Macintosh computer in front of you, an Apple computer in front of you, and perhaps you're wearing an Apple Watch. It's just examples. But many, many years ago, all Apple did was sell computers, laptops, desktop computers. The PC industry, the personal computer industry started to grow, and everyone had computers back then. Now we were replacing them. But it wasn't like there were tremendous new sales opportunities. And if you recall at a certain stage, Apple introduced the iPhone. They introduced other things, but let's just talk about iPhone for now. That actually moved Apple into a different industry, into the mobile phone handset industry. And the growth rates there were quite substantial. So this is just an example of why the 5 forces analysis can be very beneficial to companies. Because the industry that they're in might be flat or declining, but then with certain shifts and leveraging their core competencies, they can move to a new industry. When we do this analysis, there's some things that we're hoping to accomplish. And this is what we want to keep in mind when you do this type of analysis with a case study. We're going to be answering a number of questions. One is overall, is the industry attractive? Are there opportunities for growth? We want to know what kind of competitive forces the members of the industry are facing. How strong is each force? And by members of the industry, I mean other companies that operate like competitors. We want to know what are the factors driving change. We want to know where the other competitors or industry rivals sit and who is strong and who is not. We want to think about what potential moves that our rivals could make, along with the key factors to compete successfully. And if we can generate a profit, there may be opportunities for growth, but they may be so expensive that it wouldn't be prudent or financially feasible to pursue those opportunities. Now, ideally, you've had a chance to read the 5 forces and learn about the 5 forces themselves. They include rivalry among competing sellers, firms in other industries offering substitute products, potential new entrants, and then buyer power and supplier power. And these are the 5 categories or areas of analysis. And we use them to help us figure out where the pressure is coming from within the industry. And is that pressure creating opportunity, or is it perhaps damaging or detracting our ability to compete? What I want to make sure that you're able to do with each of the forces is to evaluate the business situation. So within the next couple of slides, I've given you the details of each force. Now, to operationalize this idea would be to read your case, and in your case, you're going to get information from the perspective of the company. And then you're also going to get information from the perspective of the industry. For the 5 forces analysis, we're concerned about the industry. So you're looking for data within your case and other sources that talk about the industry. Now what we can do is we can learn about the industry from the perspective of the company. That's why we read a case about a particular company. So when we think about the first force, which is potential entrants, you can use these various factors as a little bit of a checklist to ask questions about the industry. So you might ask yourself, are there economies of scale? Do the firms that operate offer proprietary product differences? Is there a unique brand identity? Are there switching costs? Are there capital requirements that are significant? Are there distribution channels that are easily accessed? Are there cost advantages? Is there government policy in place? And if a competitor decided to enter the market, would the incumbent competitor retaliate or go and attack that new competitor? So what we do with that checklist is we go and we look at the available information about the industry and maybe some of the things that the company is doing. And then we put it all together and kind of think about it as a plus-minus system. If there are a bunch of things on the plus side, meaning it's in favor of the industry, then it's less likely that somebody's going to enter. If there is quite a few negative things where the industry isn't as favored, then it's more likely that the people are going to enter, and having a new competitor threatens your ability to earn profits. So we use these different factors as a checklist. So when you're doing this type of analysis, you're using this as your guide, and then you're going to use the case to try and extract as much information as possible. And remember, you're not doing it necessarily from the point of view of the company. You're really doing it from the point of view of the industry, because we're trying to determine if a new entrant could enter that industry. Now, the second force relates to substitutes. Now, I think it's important here to understand what is a substitute product. I think that's often one of the biggest challenges in assessing this force. What is a substitute? Is it a different good that at least somewhat satisfies the same need of the consumer and can be used to replace that particular original good? There are positive cross-elasticity of demand, and what that means is that if the price of one goes up, the other also rises, so they work in opposite of each other, so to speak. The way to think about this is, an example might be watching movies. So the price of movie tickets went up. Maybe more and more people were inclined to rent movies or use a service like Netflix, which is substantially cheaper. So because of that, we could describe video on demand and streaming services as a substitute to movie theater movie watching. When we think about this force, it is helpful to evaluate those kind of examples. So just a few I could, in my mind, think of in terms of choice of transportation, for example. You could either drive a car, or you could ride a bicycle. I could use a PC to do all my classwork, or I could use a tablet. And they're substitutes for each other. I could go to McDonald's and get some food, or I can go to a grocery store and make my dinner. Or I could go to a movie theater, or I could download a movie off of Amazon. So these are all illustrations of different types of substitutes. So here are the examples that I just talked about. Now when you go back and we evaluate the forces of threats or substitutes, there are a few things that we might want to able to look at. First is, are there good substitutes that are available when we do the comparison of the price performance on a relative basis? If I have a substitute such as a movie in my living room that I downloaded or streamed, is the price of that and the experience of watching the movie on a comparison basis better, equal, or worse than going to the movie theater? Also, are there switching costs? So for me to go from the movie theater to my house to watch a movie, does that cost me anything? And then we look at just consumer behavior. How likely is that people are going to switch from one to the other? So we think about these things, and again, they help us determine how strong the pressure is. Because if there's strong pressures from substitutes, they're outside of the industry, then that could be harmful to my industry. Force number 3 then is about suppliers. There are a number of things that we would evaluate as suppliers, and these are suppliers to the industry. So the company is a producer of the product or the service, and we focus on the suppliers that provide raw materials and other inputs to that company. And here we're going to think about availability. We're going to think about differentiation, switching from one supplier to the other. Also, our ability to substitute supply concentration. How important the volume is, cost impacts of the inputs on our products, cost of differentiation. And then how able are we to go back and actually create what our suppliers are creating? Or how possible is it for our suppliers to move forward and create what we do? So we call that backward and forward integration. So another nice way to think about this could be, again, looking at our movie industry example. There's a number of suppliers to the movie industry. There are actors, there are producers, there are screenwriters, and the movie industry is dominated by big movie studios. And so if I'm a screenwriter and I want to forward integrate, I can take my screenwriting, I can hire an actor or two, and I could hire a film crew, and I could just produce the whole movie myself. It might be on a very low budget, but that would be an example of forward integration by a supplier to the movie industry. So when suppliers have a lot of power, they can influence the effectiveness and the profitabilities of firms in an industry. Now the fourth force is then buyer power. So these are the consumers or the customers of the industry. The way we think about this is, again, back to the same movie theater example. This is all of us, in fact, right? We are the buyers. We buy movie tickets. We go watch movies. And we think about two categories. One is bargaining leverage. The other is price sensitivity. And a number of different dimensions here to think about. So you think about it as a consumer. Any of us, we can go from movie watching at the movie theater to watching in our homes very easily, right? I can go to Amazon, I can stream a movie, and poof, it doesn't cost me anything except for the the monthly fee, and that gives me a great deal of power as a consumer. Now I can walk into a movie theater and say, gosh, I don't want to pay $12.50, $15 for that movie ticket. I only want to pay $10. But no, I really cannot negotiate or bargain with the cinema. My only choice really is to walk away. So the difference of those things relates to my kind of ability to influence price versus my kind of ability to influence the overall operations on the industry and to drive volume within that industry. So pricing, I can't really negotiate, but I can certainly make a choice to not buy a movie ticket, and that's going to drive down the overall industry revenues. So these ideas of buyer and supplier's power, what you want to do is you want to really visualize the firm and the industry in the middle, and then the suppliers on the left side, and then the buyers on the right side. And those, both buyers and suppliers, can create pressures on an industry. Now, last force then relates to competitive rivalry. This is really how fierce the competitors compete with each other in the industry. I think one of the best examples of this is really mobile phones, and it could be more timely, right? Because the mobile phone companies are constantly competing. You've got Sprint, you've got Verizon, you've got T-Mobile, and in fact, there are tons of these advertising campaigns where, for example, one of the most prominent ones is where the actor in the Sprint commercial used to be the actor in the Verizon commercial. Remember the guy who said, "Can you hear me now?" And they're actually making a little bit of fun of how he used to have a Verizon service. And so this is just a marketing example of how intense these firms are competing. They're actually stealing each other's unknown talent for their commercials. So we look at a number of factors again to determine how intense that rivalry is in the industry. Is it growing? Are there known costs that it takes to contribute to that product? What is our capacity to be, and how different? How strong is our brand? What about switching costs? How concentrated is the industry? How complex is it to understand? How diverse are the competitors? So when you go back and look at the mobile phone industry, for example, it used to be where the switching costs was quite prohibitive when you want to move from Verizon to T-Mobile, for example. But regulations have made it much, much easier to switch from one phone provider to another. So just, at the top level, it's how powerful are these companies, and then how easy is it to get out of the business, right? Some businesses are actually very hard to get out of. because there may be lots of assets, and so it becomes difficult to just sell off or declare bankruptcy. And so because it gets difficult to get out, they'll have to keep competing. So you can look at this intensity of rivalry, and the stronger that is, the harder it is to compete within the industry or to make really high profits. And when you see the rivalry, I've got an example here on slide 20 of some different actions that companies can take. It really shows the extent of rivalries. So price discounting, blowout sales, using coupons, advertising characteristics, product innovation, introducing new features, customization, building more dealer networks or points of access for buyers, and then improving warranties and financing. That's actually an example that you see a lot in the automotive industries, for example. So Hyundai, a few years ago, came out with a car that had 100,000 mile warranty, and which is really something unheard of in the industry. Normally cars have up to 50,000 mile warranty. So in that case, it was a way for Hyundai to really show that they were going to compete within the auto industry itself. So when you bring these 5 forces together, what you've looked at are these 5 forces, but we're not really quite done, right? Because now what we need to do is we need to ask those summary questions. So we need to synthesize what we've gathered for those 5 forces, the evaluation. What you're going to be asking is the state of competition in the industry stronger than normal? Are all industries competitive? Is the particular industry that we're talking about worse off than average? Because it means it's going to be harder to generate profits. Also, can the competition continue to place pressure on the firms and inhibit their ability to earn profits? And are there things that are actually undermining the industry? So we look at the strength of each of those forces individually, and then we look at them collectively. And then, it's a little bit of a judgment. I wouldn't say it's necessarily quantitative analysis, but I think it's just really understanding what's going on. You may have some data and some metrics that feed your analysis, but you'll also see it in the profitability of the firms that operate within the industry. That will tell you if there are challenges to the industry that are reducing or helping profits. And just as I finish this topic and give all of you just a little bit more context, because I think it's such an interesting area, I want to share one of the experiences that we've had, and just show you the power of this type of analysis, but more importantly, the power of these forces. So many of you, many years ago, you may remember. Some of you may perhaps be too young, but But I will tell you, I'll kind of bring it back into your memory. Now, in the late 1990s, when people wanted to listen to music, you went and purchased a CD and maybe even some DVDs. But there was new technology that was coming out. There was a digital format. There was something called an MP3 player. So companies such as Sony and Creative Rio and others sold these portable MP3 devices. They were tiny. They fit in your pocket. They were very convenient, and you could store a whole bunch of different songs on them. And it's also important to note that this occurred prior to the introduction of the iPod by Apple. I remember actually having one of these devices before the iPod came out, and it was decent enough, but this was all prior to the introduction of the iPod, because the iPod came out, I believe, at the October 2001. So I'm really talking about a decade earlier here. So at that time in June of 1999, there were actually some other young technologies, right? There was a company called Napster, an innovator, a disruptor, if you want to call them that, created the idea of something in the technology world called peer-to-peer file sharing. And this is very hard to imagine at the present time because we have so much technology at our disposal. But back in the 90s, you just didn't have this sort of file sharing. And what that technology allowed was people who were using MP3s to be able to share their files. And they used this through a service called Napster. And Napster was a product which was created which made it really easy for people who blog music, who wanted to download their music and share it with others. And this is really convenient because you might have a song that just isn't easy to get to anymore, and it's something that people really liked. Maybe you would have ripped it off of a CD or a record or something like that, and you wanted to share it with somebody. It also tapped into something illegal, and so there were these bootleg recordings and things that weren't released that people would get a hold of. But in some ways, this was a little bit of the wild, wild west, and people felt justified because, the purchases of a record or a cassette tape was limiting. And also, I think some people felt that it handcuffed the listeners of music in a lot of ways. So people started trading music. And some did it because they were principled, and some did it because they just love sharing music. But the point is that it became very, very easy to do this. Now we can look at this through the macro trends using Pestel that we talked about a little bit earlier, and we can look at where the trends were affecting in terms of digital music. So I've just highlighted a few things here. So in terms of the Pestel framework, at this time this was a Clinton administration in the United States. It was pro-technology, and a lot of things that were occurring that helped stimulate the proliferation of technology. Also, the economy was booming. This was Y2K and the dot-com period. Technology was driving a lot of jobs, a lot of income. It was also, as I mentioned, a little bit of Wild Wild West, and so things were doing really well. The economy was doing really well. And people felt, I think, free and rich because of the economy. There were also some social trends. So the music industry was, in some people's opinion, strangling the artists and also consumers, because they would only release records that maybe had one or two popular songs. And a lot of consumers were unhappy that they would have to buy an album with 10, 11, 12 songs when they would only really enjoy one or two of them. At the same time, the rise of the internet, right, was putting a lot of a lot of power into the hands of consumers. And this idea of sharing and connectivity was becoming a much stronger social trend. Technology, that was really the issue here. Obviously I've talked about that, but there was just a time where there was rapid advancement of the internet, of internet browsers being connected, digital internet, digital dial-ins, those sorts of things. And along with it, the legal environment was also heating up. So because this was going on with digital music, the music industry was using all their legal power to protect their copyrights. They were investing a significant amount of resources to fight this fight, and the courts were the center of the discussion about digital music. And what were the laws related to this? Because in some cases, there weren't laws that addresses these areas. So this is a good framework. It's a Pestel framework. So you can start to use this particular framework in some of your case analysis that you'll be doing. So I'm not going to show you this per se, but you can click on the center. Hopefully the link works. If not, you can still go to the link that I have below. And this is a really interesting video that talks a little bit more about Napster. If you're interested, you can hear a little bit more about him. And I think in some ways, what I want to take away from what Napster was doing at this time is that they really felt that they were advocating for the music lover, the listeners, the consumers. I don't think they didn't think they were doing anything wrong. So it's interesting to get that perspective from at that particular point in time. I remember personally as well. I was using Napster for a while as well to do file sharing and so forth. And back that time, really the question was the legality of it. I would probably be doing it maybe just to store my files and maybe not necessarily sharing it as much. But it was interesting to see the rapid advancement of Napster because of the file sharing and the clash that the music industry had from a legal perspective as well. But when you look at it, all of this had really an enormous byproduct, right? Impact. So if you think about where people used to go and buy CDs and record albums and DVDs and video games, this is all occurring through retailers. So the number of companies like Blockbuster, some of you may have heard of Blockbuster, Camelot, FYE, Musicland, they were all in shopping malls, and both in strip malls and indoor malls, and people go and purchase this. As Napster and as other services with digital music began to rise, these music retailers began to struggle. because digital music was becoming a substitute, and retail businesses were very expensive. There were prominent stores. Again, you see, for example, on the bottom left there, in the middle there was a prominent Virgin megastore in Chicago. It's a huge building, and over time they had to close their doors as well. And you can see Best Buy. We obviously know Blockbuster has closed its doors as well. So these retailers were really impacted by the confluence of digital music and file sharing through Napster. So there was a great, obviously a deal of panic by the retail industry. And one of the experiences that I want to share with you was actually some work done by Professor Schilling, who, as you may know, taught this course previously. Now, Professor Schilling was actually brought into a company to address the CEO's concerns about Napster. And in fact, the CEO wanted a plan to save the company, literally. He thought that Napster was going to put him out of business. The client that Professor Schilling worked with was an organization called Trans World Entertainment. Very sort of quiet company operating in Albany, New York. Probably the company that most people haven't really heard of. But you may have heard of the retail stores that they operated. They were called FYE, for your entertainment. And they were in strip malls as well as shopping malls. When they went in, what they were trying to do was find ways for FYE to address a substitute. And the types of things that were going on with MP3s, digital music, and Napster. What they wanted to do was leverage the strengths and the retail footprint of FYE, as well as the origins of the company and their passion for music. There were also some things that the company had done which would dilute their brand over time. They'd grown by acquisition. They had several brands that they were operating under, and that was really a problem. And then they were trying to find ways to increase their customer relationship and their customer experience, ultimately drive more purchases. So they wanted more people to come to the stores. There was a belief that if you listened to the music before you bought it, it would increase your purchase propensity. They wanted to give people access to different music products and videos, movies, video games that weren't in the store, and to be a little bit more personalized and to recommend music. And to integrate their stores and their online presence as well as using just technology. Now when you think back on this stuff is really, it's really part of our everyday life. And, for example, you can order something online from Target and go pick it up. But at that time, when we're working with these clients, that sort of capability did not exist. So the retail world and the online world were just very separate. And a lot of companies were struggling with that. And then those substitutes, products, were very much hurting their pure brick and mortar retail stores. So they built a strategy for them. They added this device called a listening viewing station, where you can scan the barcode on the product and it will play a movie trailer or some of the songs that help with the purchase behavior. They put kiosks in the store, so people could order things from the catalog where there were one product in the store itself. It also helped the sales of products and helped train the representatives within the stores. They did some things to their website to make it seem more integrated with the store experience. They added a CRM system, right, to begin to do the personalization and target marketing. Also implemented a loyalty program. Again, when you see some of these things, you might be thinking to yourself, well, that's stuff that's I experience all the time. But this is almost 20 years ago. Well, maybe not quite 20 years ago, maybe 15 years ago. But they were just things that they were foreign to companies like Trans World Entertainment. But it was part of their strategy. So what was the results? What the result was this really that it's one of the few retail stores really to businesses rather stay alive. The question is how alive, right? Eventually they closed a lot of their underperforming stores. They shifted their portfolio. So they're not really selling actual movie music and movies, music and video products anymore. They moved more towards accessories, collectibles. They essentially changed their product mix. But I think looking at them today, it's a very weak position that they're in. And if you look at the stock chart here and look at the bottom right there, the stock price around September 2017, when you compare it to previous years, you look at from over a 5-year period, it's really limping along. So while the company really made it through, really you could say that they're on life support. And that just shows the power of a couple of things, right? Industry forces, societal trends, innovation, advances in technology, advances in consumer behavior. And the question is, was their strategy enough? And can you can certainly ask it, what was it the strategy? Was it the execution? It's hard to know sometimes in hindsight, but I think that the company was really in an uphill battle, and you take into consideration that the company, for example, Blockbuster, no longer exists. And I think what Transworld tried to do, and FIE was able to do so, was in some ways relatively impressive. All right, so let's wrap up the the topic itself. So we had a good chat here, and let's look at a couple of things, a couple of lessons, right? A couple of things I want you to take away from these chapters and some of the lessons here. There's a reality here that the business issues that companies face are daunting. They're complex when you're having success, and that success can be erased very quickly. And sometimes competitors and disruption can come completely out of the blue. That's what happened to Transworld Entertainment. One day there was nothing. The next day there was Napster. And also having the right tools can help you diagnose and fix these problems. That's why we're talking about these things for this class. And I think that's really hopefully why many of you are pursuing an MBA. But it will be up to you to use these tools in the workplace. I can tell you that when you look at the Transworld Entertainment, they may have been better able to do some of this long-range planning, long-range scenario planning, using the PESTEL and the 5 forces analysis, and then maybe adding it to a much greater degree of skepticism. The third lesson here, I think, is very important for all of you personally. Businesses today need problem solvers. We want people who can come up with solutions. So this is where, as an employee, you can make a big difference in your organization, right? You can have this toolkit that you're developing, but something you have to put in place and then to solve these tough challenges for organization. And I think also the last point here is that there's a hard truth here. What we do as professionals, as leaders, as strategic thinkers, is not as easy. And if you look at history, Napster is regarded with a different view by different individuals. Some felt that they were criminal, others felt that they were heroes, but most people do credit them with bringing to an end the album-based music era. Really, nobody really buys albums anymore, and even when they do, it's more of a retro type of thing. I think if you go to Wicker Park and you go to some of these album stores and so forth, a lot of the music that they're selling, these albums especially, are really the old ones. And while there are some record players, and I think a few more record players are coming out there, it's really kind of a trendy thing that people are doing. And you probably got more music on your iPhone or your Android device. But what's also fascinating here is that Napster is even gone as well. So the final comments about the 5 forces. Remember that we're looking at the collective strength of the 5 competitive forces. And does the industry offer the opportunity to generate good profits? Let me say that again. When you're looking at the 5 forces, you're evaluating the industry and the players in the industry. Can they generate good profitability? So when you're doing your case analysis, remember that the dominant orientation is about the industry. So as we move into week 3, we're going to be focusing a little bit, we focus on the internal assessment, the SWOT analysis. We're looking at the resource-based advantages. That will be our next topic. And I think that everyone should continue to enjoy these articles. Hopefully many of you already probably had exposure to the SWOT analysis. This will hopefully be a nice review, but with a different perspective, different focus, more focus on the strategy itself. All right, everyone. So thank you for reviewing this particular video. Hopefully you had a chance. Do feel free to rewind, stop, pause, clarify. And as I mentioned, I'm actually not in class this week. So if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'll also probably be doing a video for week 3. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, I'm actually going to be out week 2 and week 3. So I'll probably do something similar. When I'm back in class, obviously we won't go through necessarily create these videos. But if you have any questions or comments or concerns, please do let me know. And good luck as you move on to week 3.